everyone. Today we're talking about another kind of literature, another movement within American literature, which was often understood as complementary to or part of American realism. You'll see here that I've lined local color up with realism, but that the temporal range for local color is much shorter, whereas realism has continued to be an influence in U.S. literature all the way up to the present. Local color was much more a genre of its moment. It was tied to a particular form of print culture. And that was the proliferation of magazines and journals, typically in the Northeast, Boston and New York, although also in cities, around the country, including Chicago and New Orleans. And let's talk a little bit about what that was. You can see here I've listed some more works. We're not reading Hamlin Garland's Crumbling Idols for this course, but he was one of the leading proponents of local color fiction, and so I've used some of his work to articulate what that was. So you can see here that local color fiction was considered crucial to realism, certainly by Garland. Not by everyone, but certainly by Garland. His idea was that local color would enable national literature to include diverse locales and cultures. You'll recall that American realism tended to focus on the urban, white, middle class, and Garland felt that there's really much more to the country than that, and our literature should reflect it. You'll notice that, like Howells, remember when Howells defined realism? Garland here thinks about local color in relation to Europe as well. He's naming several ethnicities or regions within Europe. At this time, Norway, I don't believe, was a nation. It may have been a colony of Denmark. At least it had been for much of its history at this point. These others, Catalonia, Provence, are regions within established nations. And Garland says, look, so we want our literature to be recognized as on a par with that of the old world. Well, even in the old world, they acknowledge their cultural diversity and that it doesn't neatly replicate the nations you see on the map. Our literature, he says, should do the same thing. And our goal is not to be the literature of scholars, it's not to be high culture, but rather the literature of modern people, lovers and doers, not just those who study literature in college, but people all over the nation, people in rural areas rooted in the soil, not just high culture, but everyone's culture. Again, you see that democratic impulse, democratic with a small d, the idea of producing the literature of a diverse democracy. Notice when he says the corn has flowered and the cotton boll has broken into speech, he's basically talking about the literature of the Midwest and the South, right? These are more rural areas, more agricultural. That's how the East, the metropolitan East, knows these regions. He's saying they're more than just their agricultural products. They're producing narrative. Part of that narrative includes linguistic variety, which is to say variety in speech or dialect. If you, even today, listen to the people of America, they will sound different based on where they grew up, right? Even though now we have a media that tends to promote a kind of neutral or Midwestern accent, local accents remain very prominent and important. At least Garland felt they were important. He said if you want to know how the people of this country sound, you need to study dialect, recognize that, represent it in literature. It's worth noting that elsewhere in Crumbling Idols, he notes that cities have dialects too. even neighborhoods within cities, right? So people from different boroughs from New York City will sound different. It's just a few decades after this that an Irish writer, George Bernard Shaw, would imagine a linguist, and actually this linguist was based on a real person who could locate the origins of any person from London down to the block where they grew up, right? Because different neighborhoods are filled with people who come from different places and they have their own local life, and so they have their own local accent. This interest in dialect is not really a difference between rural and urban. It is rather a desire to recognize local diversity within cities and within rural areas and just all across the country. People have different ways of speaking, and what's important here is that Garland is not introducing a hierarchy into those ways of speaking, right? In order to appreciate the intimate, social, individual life of the nation, we need to appreciate the diversity of the nation, and that means appreciating the diversity of its speech. So that all sounds lovely, right? Democratic and diverse and recognizing people from all different locales within the country. It's worth noting, though, that Garland was not the only practitioner of local color, and not everyone approached it in the same way. And Garland himself, along with some of his colleagues, they were utterly appalled by what some local color writers were doing. These, unlike realism, which was typically published in these massive novels, local color almost always appeared as a sketch or as a short story in a journal, and they would often appear next to advertisements for little bed and breakfasts you could go to if you wanted to take a vacation in the area being depicted in this sketch or short story. They were sometimes presented very explicitly as models for tourism, right? This was a period in which the middle class is growing, the upper middle class even is growing. Cities are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and when cities get bigger, that means people sometimes want a break. They want to get out of town, get closer to nature, perhaps, just have some fresh air. And local color fiction was treated by some writers and many readers as a kind of vacation guide. Oh, perhaps you would like to read a story about Maine and then go take a vacation there. Um, and this idea that you could sell, that you could present a locale, a village, a small town, a rural area as something for the urban reader to pay for an experience of knowing. This was the kind of thing that Garland got very upset about. Nonetheless, it did happen. Richard Broadhead is a scholar of American literature, and you can see he says here that that's what most of this local color fiction did. He read the journals cover to cover, issue by issue, and he says that this touristic or vacationistic prose undertakes to take some little known place far away and make it visitable in print. Make it something that you can go experience. You can pay however much you have to pay for a train ticket, a couple of meals, and a B&B, and then you'll come back and you'll know Maine. That's the kind of idea at its most reductive or crude that local color could promote. So, of course, people like Garland, who didn't like that idea, um, argued that it's very important for local color fiction to be more intimate, to be authored by someone who would never submit their hometown, for instance, to a touristic gaze. Um, you'll notice Garland says the superficial work of the tourist and outsider will not do. If you really want to write about a locale, You need to walk behind the plow. You need to be part of its agricultural labor. You need to know what education is like in these areas. Um, and again, this is not urban versus rural. As he describes it here, it's for any locality, whether an urban neighborhood or a rural region, to utter it, to describe its culture and to render that into print, you have to know it intimately. You have to be part of it. Here's another way of saying that. Um, and you'll notice that here he's somewhat essentialist, right? The idea that you have to be of that place, as indigenous as the plant growth. Um, so here it's not even about how long you've lived in a region or how well you know it. At, in this, it has to be born there for Garland. That's his idea. That's how hard he's struggling against the danger of outsiders coming in, writing a locale, and then presenting its culture for consumption by outsiders. That's really the threat. Um, Garland says that to really be of a place, to have an intimate relationship with it, you have to be born there, and then every tree and bird and mountain will be dear and companionable and necessary. Not just a scene, not a picture. Um, that term picturesque is absolutely characteristic of not only local color fiction at its most reductive, but also um, of tourism brochures and advertisement, right? Like, please come visit our picturesque locale and also visit this B&B, which will only charge you this much for a night, and that sort of thing. Garland wants to avoid that and present an intimate, true picture. It's worth noting, though, that for Garland, and he's somewhat idiosyncratic in this way, um, that true picture can only be presented by someone who was born within that locale. But for our next story, our exemplar, if you will, of local color fiction, we're going to look at Sarah Orne Jewett, who gives us a somewhat different picture.